The last 8 or 10 years have seen us become far more informed around the demands of intercounty hurling and football, and even down to club level, particularly with the advance of GPS. More importantly, how we use it in game, but also around trends. Are we specifically preparing players for the demands of what's coming games? The question remains though, what happens when it comes to camogie? Is it just a scaled down version of hurling, or are there far different demands that need to be prepared differently? Philip Connors is the ultimate expert in this, as he has completed his PhD studies on the demands of camogie in terms of GPS outputs, but also looking at physical fitness levels through specific testing. More importantly, he has been embedded with the senior intercounty team for 2 full seasons to see what are they doing, how does that prepare players for a championship, and the insights derived from GPS, how are they used to appropriately develop the players for the demands of what's to come. We dig into all this today. What are the demands? How do we prepare for them? Is it a mixture of games, isolated running, or some combination of both? What are some of the potential missing links in your training that you might need to address having listened to this today? And what are some of the things you're probably doing really well and you should keep on top of? Really interesting conversation with a true expert in this area. I'm sure there's something here for everyone to take away regardless of what code you are coaching, whether it be hurling, football, camogie or LGFA. As Philip is super experienced across the range of sports, and an awful lot we discuss can be applied across contexts. Philip, 2 of us from the same club, both of us lecturing in sports coaching and management at SETU, but I'd say it's at least 3 years since we've actually seen each other in person, and we're still online for this.
Yeah, I know, definitely it must be, yeah. It's always nice to catch up and pick your brains and vice versa, so yeah, no, delighted to be part of it.
Cool, we'll get straight into the main bit then. So you did your PhD looking at the demands of intercounty camogie. It was predominantly at the start anyway kind of GPS based, but you did a few other bits. You want to just give us a general overview and then we'll start unpacking the findings?
Yeah, so I completed my PhD and graduated last January, and it was around the whole preparation of the camogie player. So started with some physical performance profiling, so your speed, your lower body power, your aerobic fitness, and then moved into some of the running demands during match play using GPS, and then took it from there, from match play into training demands, looking at different kind of training modalities and comparing it back to the match play demands to see maybe how they fit, and then wrapped it all up together, I suppose, at the end with some surveys and interviews of the coaches and managers that were involved, and how maybe the research that we were using, how it compared to what they were actually doing at the moment, and some of the reasons why maybe the two didn't align or why they did align then as well. So started quantitative and trying to provide normative data, and ended up then maybe just trying to get an understanding of some of the limitations and some of the factors around preparing camogie players then as well.
Good, yeah. I'm looking forward to getting into how the demands and how the practices try and meet those demands align and sometimes don't align. We'll start off. So you began looking at fitness profile, just like a few, so you might give us the actual tests, give us some norms, but then we'll see how much of a variance was there, say, across panels, and then even, obviously you can't say the teams that are involved, but how many did you look at, and were they all kind of tier 1 or division 1 counties, or was there a bit of a spread?
Yeah, so I suppose like any research that was conducted at the time, it happened just before COVID and we had other plans, and then it got slightly interrupted. But we looked at testing 2 intercounty camogie teams that were at senior level. There was 35 players involved on each panel. So the sample size, like when you consider that there's 12 senior teams, and then where we're based in the southeast region, it was kind of whatever we could entice in to do a testing session. So we looked at their speed across 5, 10 and 20 metres. We looked at their lower body power using a counter movement jump, their reactive strength index using that 10-5 repeated jump test. And then from a strength perspective, we chose to use the isometric mid-thigh pull, just considering some maybe of the training ages that were involved, and then we finished with aerobic fitness using the yo-yo IR1 then as well. So those were the tests we looked at, and we just ran through them, and it was in the pre-season phase when it was, and compiled some of the data looking at the different positions then as well. And I suppose that was a recurrent theme throughout when we looked at positions, and obviously GAA and Camogie are position and line specific, but the interchange of players right through each line meant that we ended up just grouping them as defenders, midfielders and forwards, because your cornerback became your wing back and your wing back maybe took back into the corner and vice versa. So we looked at defenders, midfielders and forwards then, and how their performance profiles differed across position. And then at the same time at SETU there was another research student looking at the Irish international football team and doing similar research there, so we're able to compare them as well.
Much differences, first of all, within the Camogie team, but then Camogie compared to, when you say football, it's soccer.
Soccer, yeah, soccer.
Association football.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's look, it was actually a pretty homogenous group, and it was all self-reported. So it was a new management team in at the time. So players were reporting that they were maybe defenders, and then management came in and maybe they ended up being midfielders or whatever. So there was actually no position-specific difference between defenders, midfielders and forwards when we done the performance testing. But when we did look at it, and Brian Dial's research with the Irish international team, they were below the level of their soccer peers, so right across the board. And this was 5 years ago, and S&C within Camogie and within ladies sport, from a Gaelic perspective, has advanced an awful lot since then. But at that time it was probably relatively new. There maybe wasn't a whole pile of gym work being done, and some of that was related to facilities and funding and bits and pieces that maybe cropped up later in the research. But they were below across all the tests, whether it was speed, whether it was aerobic capacity, which maybe had to do with the distance the ball travels and a couple of other nuances there. But I suppose it was kind of in its infancy when this was 2020, so S&C was probably in its infancy from a structured gym session kind of viewpoint, I suppose.
And we'll dig into this a bit more as we go on, but you were embedded with a team then afterwards, and even just anecdotally, without going and publishing stuff, did you notice many big improvements over the course of a couple of seasons from what those baseline tests were?
Yeah, no, like there definitely was, and like I said, it was the pre-season, so it's not to do Camogie players a disservice either. They'd come off the back of however long there was a new management in place. This was probably their first time meeting. It was the first or second week in November, so you wouldn't expect that they're at their peak levels either. And the hope for our research was to look at it across 3 or 4 different times points across the year, and then COVID happened and that kind of hindered that. But absolutely, yeah, no, there was, without doubt, we done a couple of other bouts of more informal testing sessions, whether it was the gates or whether it was, a yo-yo IR1, and there was huge improvements to be seen then as well. So
did they come up more in line with the soccer? Sorry, or was there still a gap? That informal testing you did later.
The gap is still there. The data, so when it was done, it was average data that we looked at, but there was players part of that panel in November who may not have made it, but then we didn't exclude them because it wasn't on their actual performance profile that they didn't make it. It could have been their actual skill or tactical awareness later down the line. So but to answer your question, the gap definitely did close, but they're still behind where that needs to be. And I suppose if we're looking at it from a plyometric perspective, their reactive strength index was down when you looked at the 10-5 repeated jump test. So when you talk about future research, we're now trying to look at a plyometric intervention and with Gaelic field sports and female field sports to try and devise a plyometric intervention that can be rolled out then across, and that's a project I'm co-supervising at PhD there, and Andrew Lane is carrying that research out. So hopefully then we'll be able to maybe track that in the next couple of years and actually compare back then and see where we're at with that. So the S&C has moved on, but I just don't have the data maybe to publish that it has definitely closed the gap there.
At the time, did you find the biggest discrepancy was in the RSI, or was it just it was the biggest lack of research done in an area? That's why you've gone with this. Yeah,
and a lot of it was depth jumps and drop jumps, and I suppose you see from the research a strong or a really good RSI correlates really well with whether it's lower body strength or power or speed. So that was one area that we went after, and it's probably an untapped or unknown area. And it's also something that they don't really get from their match play either. So they'll sprint and they'll get fitter, but they'll jump, but their RSI maybe isn't something that's honed in on, and their plyometrics maybe not so much given the respect that's needed then in actually preparing a camogie player.
Yeah, I'd say, because there's so much out there as well on like how to get a bit fitter, how to get a bit faster, how to get a bit stronger. I think like non-S&C coaches who are somewhat informed can deliver a reasonably effective program there. Whereas when I think it comes to plyometric, I don't think many are as confident and are probably a little bit more haphazard in their approaches there. So it's good that you'll show effects of this, but hopefully ways to practically implement it as well. You look then also at actual demands of the game. This is more GPS based. And we'll try to look at actually some numbers here. I know I don't want to spend ages reeling off numbers on a podcast. It can be hard for people to take in, but there are a couple here that would be useful.
Yeah, so again, looking at the positional groups, we looked at this. We looked at both in kind of two separate studies from a half by half comparison to see the discrepancies between the first half and second half. And when we seen that there was some, we dug a little bit deeper, and it was the time that the quarters were in match play as well. So the 4 quarters, 15 minutes. So we broke it down into 5-minute intervals across the game as well to get a better understanding. So, look, anecdotally, it would be well known that midfielders generally do cover the most amount of ground, but I suppose there was no normative data out there to show that. So our research showed that, and that midfielders are covering around 6.5 kilometres in a game, and then our defenders, on the other hand, are probably covering somewhere around the 5.6, 5.7 kilometres. So there's a kilometre there of a difference between those two positional groups. And then when you look at the likes of sprinting, the sprint distance, there could be up to about 220 metres of sprint distance, which is over 5.5 metres per second for the forwards. So they were covering the most sprint distance. And then the defenders, again, were the lowest on that. So I suppose they have different demands whether it's marking their player or it's maybe not making that sprint or not making that move for fear of missing the ball or whatever. So that's probably playing into that. But the high speed running, again, you see your forwards and midfielders covering a lot more of that than your defenders. So for us, I suppose it was, well, if we're seeing this, is there a way, bearing in mind that they're moving between positions so regular, is there a way maybe of best preparing players there? Do our midfielders need more volume? Do our forwards need more sprint exposures, accel and decel exposures? So it's just asking those questions. And then when I mentioned the half by half, you see your midfielders dropping in performance an awful lot more from first half to second half. So again, when you're looking at it from a tactical perspective, the introduction of substitutes, how can you offset that decrease in performance then as well? So that's kind of the match play. And then, like I said, you're looking at the 5-minute intervals. So the first 5 minutes of match play, and whether that's a psychological thing or whatever it is, showed the most kind of distance covered right across the board. And the largest decrement was happening, funnily enough, it was happening the 5 minutes coming into half time. So whether players were kind of just, getting tired towards the end of the half, or maybe they were already in the dressing room. But it also happened the 5 minutes after half time. So that 10 minutes or 15 minutes sitting in the dressing room, does that kind of limit and hinder performance, and is a re-warm up necessary? Now, that's not something we touched on, but you would see in some other sports that the re-warm up, or there's a couple of sprints or a couple of jumps before they play the second half. So that decrement was still there even after the rest. It then rose, and the 5 minutes from 40 to 45, which was the end of the third quarter, we seen a decrease again before it rose then coming up to the end, where you have an introduction of substitutes and maybe they bring a newfound energy. The result is obviously on the line, but that research, I suppose, just asked a couple of questions of answers of which we didn't get to look at, but I just found that after half time and the re-warm up maybe might be an untapped area as well for people.
Yeah, that is interesting. I have a couple of bits to follow on there. The sprint distance. Is sprint speed or are sprints classified the same way for females as they are for males? Is there a lower number you work off there?
There is a lower number. So it was 5.5 meters per second, which is in and around kind of 20 kilometers an hour.
Whereas 22 for males, is it?
Yeah, so it is slightly lower. And look, there was the whole piece around individualising it versus generic, but we just found the match play demands are generic demands, so we set it at that rather than kind of trying to manipulate it as the season progressed. So it's slightly lower there, yeah.
And use the forwards and midfielders cover more high speed running. What generally is the high speed run demands?
So the high speed run, you're looking at probably 550 meters in a game. So in total, like that's set at 4.4 meters per second, which is in and around 16 kilometers an hour. So you're talking between high speed run and sprint distance up around 700 to 800 meters of your 5.5 to 6.5 kilometers. So I suppose the thing is not that camogie players cover 6.5 kilometers, let's go make them do 5k and 6k and 7k runs. There is maybe the guts of a kilometre there that is high speed running, that is sprinting, so it just needs to be kind of informed in that manner as well.
And that high speed running and those sprints, that's all broken up sporadically across the game. Is there any like average number of sprints or average sprint distance we have to look into?
Yeah, so Damien Young has done it, and I don't actually have the numbers to hand, but there are a specific number. It could be 22 sprints in a game that's covered that they have a sustained effort over a second. So they are broken down, and Damien Young has some other normative data published where he maybe delved into that element of it a little bit more, whereas my research probably swayed away from the game demands and kept those kind of key 4 or 5 metrics and wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the training demands and so on. His was probably digging a little bit deeper into the actual match play demands and what they entailed.
I think I remember looking at it from hurling. Is 17 the average number of sprints in a game, and they tend to last around on average 3 seconds long, but I can't remember specifically if that's exactly it or not. More importantly then, as you said there, meeting those demands through training. So we've established that between 5.5 and 6.5k is covered, up to a kilometre that is high speed running or sprint distance, but that's broken up. How then should that inform our training to ensure we're still preparing them physically, but we're keeping the core concept of camogie somewhat at the centre of it?
Yeah, so the next step of that project was to just observe, and maybe, as you said, I was with a senior Intercounty Camogie team for a couple of seasons during this, and it was to observe their training, define maybe a couple of different modalities. So we had it broken down into training matches, which were 15-15 traditional training. We had small-sided games, which were an all-encompassing small, medium and large-sided games. So small-sided games was the term that we used, and that was anything that wasn't a training match, that was game-based. And then we had drills, which are, isolated skill development. And then we had isolated conditioning, which is when it was, you don't need your hurls and helmets for this, you can leave them out and we're going to focus on something. Whether that was speed, whether that was some kind of MAS work, or it was a long, slow distance block, that's what isolated conditioning was. So it was pretty much observational. We had the GPS on for each training session, tracked what they were doing. We looked at the total volumes, which were hard to compare because you have a game on Saturday, Thursday night is really light, so there wasn't a whole pile of training or total distance done there, so it was hard to compare. So what we done was we looked at relative distances instead, so distance covered per minute of an activity or whatever. So we compared each of those 4 back to the actual competitive match play, and what we found was, I suppose, across the board, isolated conditioning, as we know, we prescribe and we know what we're getting, so that surpassed the match play demands because it was designed to do that, and that will be expected. Drills, again,
Is that per session or across the week, the isolated conditioning? So in a session, are you doing more than a game, or over the course of a week would you accumulate?
So in a particular session, and again, bearing in mind it's relatively based, so it's per minute, so it's not the total volume we're always looking at. So that could mean that we do a huge block, and then maybe in another session we don't, and all the sessions compiled together show us our relative demands. So some nights you could be way over what the competitive match play demands are. Other nights, like I said, that Thursday night puck around or Friday night puck around, maybe not so much. And it's the same with drills.
How strategic was that? I know you were observing, but from observing, was there an intentional focus put on, we are going to exceed game demands here, or was there just a general plan around, we'll do these runs, and when you calculate it afterwards you realise this is way more than what we need in games? It
was probably more of the latter. We had the conversation a number of times, and they were really open to the whole GPS space and the data, and like I said about those 5 minutes and trying to incorporate all that into it. But we did find when we had the choice of going with live data or going with retrospective analysis, we chose retrospective. We chose to just let them at the work. It was relatively new, and maybe not to take our eye off what was important. It was like I said, a new management. So the focus was, let's put our own stamp on it, and we'll look at it later, and we can manipulate it then the following year if needs be. But let's not take our eye off what's important and chase kind of those 1 or 2 percenters. Let's just get what we want out of it first. So
I think that's really important too, though. Like I'd say an awful lot have done that previously, and I know a lot of this came from soccer, that let's observe, let's see what's happening, and then having done it all, we can start tweaking our games. I think if we get too focused in on let's design games specifically to meet physical demands, we might forget the key concepts of possession with purpose, attack, defence, putting the ball over the bar or into the net. And if we focus on those and then check what distance is covered at various metrics, it takes a few tweaks, as opposed to sometimes we can just lose the forest for the trees going the other way.
Exactly, and like something as simple as retrospectively looking at the likes of those 5 minute intervals or our training post-league, and then we can make some tweaks maybe coming in the 6 weeks of a lead up through the provincial into the All-Ireland series. That was maybe more beneficial than actually trying to do it on a week by week basis when we were just observing at the time. So that's why the focus was that way. And ultimately it meant that I wasn't trying to manipulate the data that I was collecting either. You know, it was purely observational. It was purely giving me back what was happening on the ground, and I think that was the purpose of my research rather than trying to manipulate it at the time. So yeah, that was the approach, and I think it's probably the best approach. I always say sport, it's an art, it's not an exact science, so let's keep the art as the primary focus and let the science maybe just support us then with what we need as well.
And did you help the management team try to put together like a little bank of games? And that's something I'm always tying with. Okay, I know this game gives me mainly what I want to focus on hurling wise, but in terms of physical outputs, it ticks these boxes. So I just look across the week, I want to try and hit these different types. Did you go that far? Were there kind of little conversations around that as well?
Yeah, and like I suppose you're always dipping into other sports as well, and Shane Malone had published an awful lot of work around games and game-based coaching and the demands of that, whether manipulating the number of players or the pitch sizes or whatever it was. So we knew that if we opened it up, there would be more volume, there'd be more high-speed running, and if we closed it down and maybe wanted more of an intense tackling-based kind of focus from a hurling or camogie perspective, we were getting more accelerations, we were getting more decelerations. So we were able to kind of map that without actually saying, right, we need 40 by 20 and we need 4v4, because again, research is brilliant, but in an applied setting, suddenly that 4v4 becomes a 4v3 and suddenly someone steps out, and rather than manipulating these all the time, it was, yeah, right, if we go large, which is in this range, and we go small, which is in this range, we know what we're focusing on, and maybe then use your isolated conditioning to tick the other box. So if we're really, really small sided games tonight, loads of intensity, loads of excels, maybe we'll open it up then and we'll do longer distance stuff in our isolated conditioning if we're using that versus, oh, we're after playing a large sided game. Maybe we actually need to focus a little bit on our X cells and D cells in our isolated conditioning tonight. So those were the conversations, as opposed to actual prescription of actual like grid sizes and playing numbers and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'd take a very similar approach. I look at what game is there, and any condition I do then, I just try and do the opposite of it. If it's a longer open game, we'll do shorter condition. If it's smaller sided games, I look to do longer condition, just because it helps, I suppose, fill up the other bucket, but also helps minimise the chance of overloading players in any way. Did you find, was there more, not say bang for buck in terms, was there something that was done more than you expected when you were observing? You're like, Joe, we probably actually don't need as much of this other thing. They're getting so much from some of the games they play, we might not need these few runs, or there was something majorly missing in retrospect that we definitely need to keep topped up.
Yeah, and the simple answer to that is speed. So like, you look at the research now that's been published, and looking at it at the time, actual speed, and it brings its own challenges in a GA perspective when you're looking at recovery and all the rest, and trying to kind of fill the time to make sure they're adequately recovered before they're sprinting again. But speed is definitely something that the games weren't allowing. So those sprint exposures, we weren't reaching maybe what they were reaching in matches, and they weren't reaching maybe what they needed to be reaching either. And these games, so they could have been anything from 10 by 10 grid and a 2v2 right up to half a pitch, but when you looked at it across the board, the sprint exposures on a relative metric wasn't being met compared to the match play demands. So you're isolated conditioning, and as a result, and when I say conditioning, you're conditioning the player to play the game, maybe just needs to be some acceleration and some max velocity exposures, and everything else can be got through your game then as well.
And you're probably looking to do that much earlier in the session, knowing it needs to be put in, and then layer all your games after that, because I find for freshness anyway, it's generally the best time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's pretty much, and that probably, and we'll come to it, we'll lead on to maybe the actual session sequencing and design of that then as well.
Yeah, when we go into, we'll jump into that now, but one bit, having looked at it all, seeing what works well, what maybe isn't as effective, are there maybe 3 things you would suggest now, coaches listen to this, not to include in every session, but 3 key pillars to include across the training week that you feel give a lot of physical benefits or stimulus that are still cognizant of keeping camogie at the centre?
Yeah, well, I suppose when we dive into the next part, it will probably be discussed as well, but the actual use of games to generate physical conditioning and develop physical fitness is definitely one. So when we look at the data from those games and from training matches, which actually ticked every box right across the board, we see that they're actually getting all the conditioning that is probably required by just playing matches, and that's 15 on 15. That is your small-sided or medium-sided or large-sided games. The speed then is number 2, where we need to try and get those speed exposures, but also it's multifactored as well, in that we talk about a minute recovery for every 10 metre sprinted. So if we're trying to get max velocity and it's a 40 metre sprint, how we fill that 4 minutes, and is that them standing around, does that actually benefit them from a team environment and a coach and management buy-in? Probably not. Do we need some kind of isolated skill development to fill that, and how that is? And I'm probably still working through that a little bit as well, to be honest, of the trade-off between sprinting and getting the actual adequate recovery, and also getting on with the session, because it's only 3 hours a week or whatever it is. So but definitely trying to get some speed exposures is number 2. And number 3, and it does get a bad rap, is the whole skill development and drills area, but I think it does tick a lot of the physical boxes, because we can manipulate it and design it, and you will see kind of workshops and things with developing fitness with the ball, and a lot of the time it's drill based, but you are ticking a couple of boxes. Yes, you're not getting the tactical or maybe the decision making or the spatial awareness, but you can still incorporate, and I think it still has a place. Definitely in my coaching as well. It's not all black and white.
I find managing recovery around speed, no one's getting that right. No one. Like, it's so hard, because if you're giving them enough time to fully recover, the manager's looking at you like, why are they standing around so much? And if you start dipping into drills, someone gets too excited and recovery goes out the window. And if you don't give them enough time, they're either not sprinting all out or they're slightly at risk of injury. No, I don't think anyone gets that right, but we do as best as we can. Next then, you want to jump into a bit on session sequencing. I find this really important too, both in terms of like a once-off session, but also over the course of the week and where matches fall.
Yeah, so the next part of that, I suppose, again, we're looking at, well, what's actually happening on the ground. We can't make recommendations to people if they're already doing it, because it's not a recommendation, and you're just reinforcing what's already been done, and maybe it's not of value to people. So we done some surveys with coaches right from under 14 right the way through to senior intercounty, so all the way through the intercounty pathway, looking at their session sequencing. So what came first in the session? Generally warm up, but after that, what came next? And so on and so forth in a session. And then we also looked at, well, in the pre-season, what kind of percentage of training modalities are we using? So how much of a session is geared towards games? How much of a session is geared towards isolated conditioning and drills then as well? And then how does that compare into the peak season? So is there a difference, and does the focus shift between the two? And I suppose from a session, isolated session perspective, we're seeing that it's very much it's the warm-up followed by skill development, drills based coaching. Then we might move into some kind of small sided games. We'll finish with a match, and then we'll get them all to put their hurls and helmets down, and we'll do a blocker run at the end to finish. So that was kind of the general session design, and that was through pre and peak season. And I've used that session design multiple times myself, and there's reasons for it and there's reasons against. But when it's been done all the time, and we're not dipping into like a whole part whole, and we're using drills just for the sake of using drills, and your hand passing the drill goes on for 10 minutes, then what is the purpose, or what's the theme of our session, or what are we trying to achieve? So again, like I said, drills sometimes get a bad rap, but if we're using a game to start and we realise high fielding or long striking is not where it needs to be, maybe we can dip back into a drill that focuses on high fielding or long striking. And then with that in mind, we might go back into the game with the focus being on, if we get a high catch, it's worth 5 points in this game. So we're suddenly using the game, we're using the drill to inform the game rather than just doing drills for the sake of it, and work on our touch and work on our touch and work on our touch, and what this touch is when it comes into games, because the tactical awareness comes in, the decision making comes in, and all those other parts. So that was probably the number one finding, was maybe that the session sequencing was just done in the traditional manner, and not maybe drills informing game and game informing drills.
Good. And did you look at sequencing across the week a bit then?
So probably not so much across the week. We probably looked more around the percentage of time spent in a typical session in the pre-season on what we called training form activities, which are isolated drills and isolated running, and on game-based activities, which were small-sided games and your training matches, and how they fitted in to your pre-season versus your peak season, and was there a difference in what we chose to use on each one. And there was a difference, I suppose. In pre-season, the focus was very much on drills and on isolated conditioning, with a small bit of small-sided games through in, very little training matches. When we go into the peak season, everyone wants to play the training matches, wants to get their small-sided games, and the drills and the isolated conditioning dropped in as a result.
Would there be recommendations there on what? There's no ideal, there's no perfect, but are there ways at looking at blending those a little bit more differently than what's traditionally done that might have better outcomes? And I would say there's probably difference here in terms of county v club, you have to take different approaches, because county, you generally know majority of players will be there all the time, bar an injury, whereas club, and in most situations, I don't know everywhere, but anywhere I've been, the seniors train, as do the intermediates or junior A's, and there's often junior B's or C's or D's or E's or F's, however far down the alphabet you want to go, and you're like, sure, I'll have my 24 seniors, there's a good chance I'll have 12 or 16 junior A's. I could have 3 junior F's, I could have 15 junior F's, I don't know, and that makes planning a little bit more difficult sometimes.
Yeah, and like this was in an intercounty environment, so whatever struggles or difficulties they have is probably amplified when you take it to a club scenario, because of some of those reasons and the likes of facilities and different bits and pieces and access to pitches. But I suppose if you look at the likes of Paul Kinnerk's research and other research within Australian football as well, this linear session sequencing where we start with warm-up, go to drills, move to games and finish with conditioning happens right across the board, and it happens because it's traditional and that's kind of what was always done. But I suppose when you look at my research and you see that small-sided games and training matches can meet the match demands from a physical perspective, and we also know that tactically we can develop our players' tactical awareness using games and decision making. And then there's research coming out as well where we can actually develop, and it's a little bit harder to maybe measure, we can actually develop players' technical skills as well. So when I say small-sided games, we can use overloads, and that's something that I would often use is like, let's go 4v2. So the two in the middle are getting a huge increase in their actual physical output. The 4 on the outside are getting skill development, but it's in a semi-pressurized environment. So suddenly now we don't need to work our touch or focus on isolated striking to hand multiple times or for 10 minutes of a session if we can use it in an overload scenario where we're ticking each box. So it's things like that I think that we could use, because we're also developing physical fitness and we're developing them in a technical and tactical manner as well. So that is probably the goal standard when you look at coaching and the research around coaching and the recommendations of it, that we should be trying to use game-based in as many scenarios as possible, because it ticks so many boxes. And I mentioned we only have them for maybe 3.5, 4 hours a week. So let's maximize the actual time we have with them rather than spending 10 minutes warming up, 10 or 15 minutes doing drills, and then the last half an hour is now we'll play our game stuff.
Some of that, like the session sequence, I often think the traditional one is far easier to justify because of the perceived knock-on impacts of one part of the session to the next, to the next, to the next. And like, I would do conditioning at the end of the majority of sessions, and I've experimented at times with dip it in the middle, and just the fatigue and how that impacts energy levels and everything for the 5 to 15 minutes afterwards. I'm like, I just don't think it's worth it, and that's why I keep pushing at the end. But you also have to consider the role of the coach or different coaches within the setup, and you have to balance like it being broken up, and sometimes it can work really well. This coach does, like, I actually don't warm up and then drills. I've swapped that now. I do the drills as part of, do a load of skill work first, and then you're into your more specific warm-up-y stuff. I think it's a nice way to raise while still doing all the skills and stuff. And like, if say one coach does that, then another comes in for the warm-up, then someone does a drill, and then, say coach A, coach B, if they dovetail well off each other, that can work really well. But sometimes there's very, very clear lines between the hurling or football coach does hurling or football, the SSC does anything physical, and they don't dovetail, they don't communicate. It's like, here's your 20 minutes, here's your 12, here's your 8. And that's why it would often fit that one does the warm-up, one does condition at the end, and they get their 10 to start, 20 to end, and the sports coach does the middle. I think that's why a lot fall into that routine as well, that it can be difficult to manage the dynamics between the coaches in the back room to make it flow that bit better as well.
Yeah, and just even looking at some of the content that you're putting out around isolated conditioning and should it be used and when should it be used, and if any team I've ever coached or am coaching at the minute look in at this, they're probably screaming at it going, well, you're all game based, but yet there's always conditioning at the end of your session. And part of it is this perceived mental, whole mental kind of training and preparation as a team. But there's other parts of it is that you don't have that control in a game, so you're not 100% sure without GPS that they are actually reaching the output in a particular session. And sometimes maybe you can go above what you intended to do, but you can always pare that back in a subsequent session. But isolated condition, again, when you look at the traditional sense and what players expect, they expect that there is some isolated conditioning at points in the year as well, and it probably does help with team morale. So that is the connection again between trying to develop it from a sports science perspective, but also going back to the coaches and the buy-in and the actual players and what they expect, so that in their head the work is done. We've got through this tough conditioning block together, and there is an awful lot psychological around that as well. But yeah, it's one of those, there is no right answer. A linear session that's well planned and well designed, that's enjoyed by all the players and the coaches are happy, that definitely has its place. It's more, our research went from surveys, and then we went and we looked at the actual management and spoke to the managers there. So they then went and they looked at we spoke with them around why this linear session sequencing is happening. So why are you choosing to use these modalities? And some of it was, well, if you don't have the sharpness and the hurling and just skill development, then you can't go into a game. And if you don't have the fitness, you can't go into a game. So there's this element of you need to earn the game nearly. And that to me is kind of more concerning, is probably not the right word, but maybe it is a little bit concerning that the game can't be used, then you have to earn that right. And this was at adult level. So that's more where I'm coming from in using games as opposed to your actual session design and why are you using drills in front of games. We should be incorporating games as much as possible, and whether that's training matches or it's small city games, we can use them, and we don't need to focus on skill development prior to them actually getting to play a game in peak season. And to go back to your other point on kind of sports science versus coaching and maybe them not dovetailing or interlinking together, there's an element of, number one, maybe not an understanding. The S&C coach does their thing, was one of the quotes kind of that came back, and the hurling coach focuses on the hurling. But then there's also the part where some of them maybe didn't feel that the sports science or S&C person understood the sport enough to actually have an input into a session. So again, you're looking at it completely through the science lens without kind of respecting the actual sport. And that was one area then that they found that maybe it's harder for us to incorporate the S&C and the sports science into it if they don't understand or respect the sport as well. So I suppose that's it from the other side, that they're not maybe fully buying into the sports science because the sports science is maybe not fully buying into the traditional coaching sport.
Yeah, there's both ends to that. Sometimes someone coming from a completely different sport, taking a fresh approach to it and challenging a few assumptions can be really good. But how you challenge those assumptions and how you communicate that across is also so important. Because if you've done something a certain way for years in your coaching practice, and someone else comes in and says, yeah, I don't like that, we need to change all this. That's just not the way to approach change or evolution in any situation. But at the same time, with a coaching or an S&C or sports science or whatever ficking hat you want to put on, and you're saying, let's get as much as we can from games, and you look at the games and you're like, do you know what? Physically, there's not much being got from this because there's an awful lot of standing around. There's very slow restarts. There's too many players on the field. The pitch is either way too big, so a couple of really fit players are dominating, everyone else is doing very little, or the pitch is way too small, and there's no one getting a run more than 20 metres long because there's a crowd on them all the time. So there's both sides to look at there. I think they all need to work together. No question.
Yeah,
there.
And the other part, and I suppose all the managers in this were all male. They'd all come from hurling backgrounds. So some of them felt that they had to focus on skill development because in their mind, and it goes back to like this perceived image of what a session should look like, the games were too messy and were breaking down too often. And they felt that they weren't getting what they wanted from it then because it didn't look nice. And this element of like perfect coaching and a perfect session. Whereas in my, like I'm saying, well, if it's breaking down in training, it's going to break down in the All-Ireland semi-final. So you're just preparing your players for what's actually coming down the line. So in your mind, it should be perfect. And we're doing sharp puckouts and we're working it through the lines and the forwards are trying to overturn the ball. And it's breaking down, but it'll also break down the game. So you're actually exposing them just to the match play demands physically, and like the actual skill development. Well, can you just create an overload then instead, maybe to try and work that through, rather than making it feel like, well, until we get 10 minutes of striking to the hand, that there's no ball on the ground, then we can't go into the game scenario. So, and like some of these coaches have this background in sports science and S&C, and like it's well thought through. So it's not that they haven't maybe given it consideration, but at the same time, I think a pretty session maybe isn't something that we're getting a whole pile from either, because there's no learning in that.
And from looking into the questionnaires around coaching approaches, was that like majorly surprising, or was that you looked at? That is a different way of thinking about it I hadn't considered before, but I'm intrigued by it.
Well, like I suppose when you talk about, and we're talking intercounty, so we're talking like elite camogie players, and then I'm talking to some coaches and the managers, and I'm saying, well, why are we not doing game-based or training matches in the peak season, like what, or in the pre-season? Like why? You have this data, you've read the research, you think it's good, and they're saying, but we don't have a training base. The facilities that we're given, one of the managers came back and said, I've 150 metres of a running track and a small Astro that's 40 by 20 to try and get done what I want to get done in the pre-season until we hit March and the light, becomes a bit longer and the hour changes and suddenly we have that. So he was like, there's your answer. That's why we're using this. We have this track for isolated conditioning. We have this Astro to do skill development. So I can't, unless I do a weekend session, get in training matches and small city games. And like you'll see it in club scenarios. Like, and again, it's not something probably that I haven't come across. And I've worked with numerous club teams, and that's what happens. You end up doing some skill development. You might try and play a game or two where half the team are on and half the team are off, and then you'll finish with some isolated conditioning because that's all that's available to you. So there are, again, when we talk about science and then when you talk about the actual realistic implications, there are things holding them back at elite intercounty level. And if it's happening there, then like what's happening at club level, and what's restricting them or limiting them in what they're trying to achieve. Yeah,
that's good. That brings us on to our last point. I just want to look at some female-specific factors that should be considered. Say if someone is new to has previously coached hurling or football, is now going into camogie or LGFA. From a physical point of view, what are some things that possibly need to be considered that you wouldn't maybe see as important or as relevant in males? And that's thinking like common injuries or potential weaknesses, but also, as you touched on there, logistical ones or potential psychosocial factors that need to be considered.
Yeah, and there's obviously commonalities and there's also differences. When we look at the likes of what I said, the access to pitches, facilities, and I probably from our own club, it was never something that was considered because everyone just got equal access all the time to the pitch. So whether it was the under 8 camogie team or the senior men's team, it didn't matter. Whoever was on the pitch got priority, and that was it. But you go to other clubs and into county setups, and the female teams, they might get the second pitch or they may not get the floodlit pitch and whatever. So those are definitely considerations of trying to actually coach a team within that kind of female environment around the logistical part of it. From an intercounty perspective, there's the balancing kind of the budget as well. So what we actually need to spend our money on. So do we spend it on some nutrition after training, and whether that's, you know, a dinner or it's a shake or whatever it is, or do we spend it on GPS, or do we spend it trying to get some sports science support to actually manage that GPS? So those are also considerations. So when you're coming across from a hurling setup or a football setup, and you're kind of expecting maybe to have some of this support, you may not have, and you may need to. An example again, one of the managers got access to GPS for 2 weeks, done what you had mentioned earlier around like actually devising their games and drills to see what we would get from it, and then they knew going forward, well, this one will give me this amount of kind of sprint exposure, this one will give me loads of volume, and etc. So that might be something that you might have to do to try and to balance the books and balance the playing field there. And like, look, the rate of cruciate ligament injuries, when you look at number one, the load. So your really top players will play with multiple teams, and that's going from under 14 right the way through. They'll be pulled up, they'll play at 16, they'll play 16s, they'll play minor, they'll play adult, they'll play county, they'll play club, they'll play schools, they may play other sports. So the load is put on them, but also maybe the appreciation for the actual prehab that needs to be done then as well. We see from their performance profile, and they are below where they may need to be compared to some of their peers. So that S&C maybe need to be focused on that bit more, a couple of times a week. So those are probably the key considerations, and that's without the likes of your menstrual cycle and the different kind of factors that are associated with coaching a female team. And there's some really good research being done around that and the impact of different phases and all the rest. But from a purely logistical purpose, that's kind of maybe where the focus needs to be, that there's an appreciation that you are not working with the same level of support from a sports science and S&C perspective.
Something I'm still surprised at, and I don't know if it's a funding thing or a lack of awareness thing, that the majority, not all now, the majority of male adult teams will have some form of S&C support. They might not have an S&C there, but they'll at least have a coach who knows a bit about it. They'll get someone in that'll give a bit of guidance around it, whereas that is still so rare in a lot of female teams now. There are some excellent S&Cs, and some clubs are really proactive about it right through the ages, but there's still so many who just get in the local fitness person or someone who does circuits, and for a lot of times people said, well, it's better than nothing, and I'm almost at the point now saying, no, it's actually not. It's not anymore, because they're just missing too many of the big pieces that are too important. And I don't know, are they getting fitter? Because so many times they're just making them tired, they're fatigued, their movement quality drops massively, and then after 6 weeks it's gone completely, and you just go back to the old traditional way of doing it. I think there needs to be some form of an onus put on clubs to be a little bit more responsible around the care they give to the players in that situation.
Yeah, and like, we've both worked in underage development squad scenarios and doing club workshops around athletic development and stuff, and although it's not perfect to not, you know, be there and delivering the session every week or whatever it might be, to go in and do a couple of sessions, and whether it's your, you know, benching and your deadlifting and, you know, a couple of prehab exercises, hamstring work and you know, maybe some lunging or whatever it is, that is probably better than nothing. So getting John Murphy in for 2 nights to then just mimic that session for the next 4 weeks before you come back again, and the same from a conditioning perspective, rather than running crazy distances, can you actually devise a 4-week running program where there's a 30-minute running session and someone just needs a stopwatch and a couple of cones and they can mark out distances and run that session? That's probably a better approach than just getting someone in to make them tired. Like, anybody can make somebody tired. Like, that's the easiest thing in the world to do. You get them to do burpees for 10 minutes and no one can walk, and we had a great session. But to actually improve the movement quality is a completely different thing. But there's enough qualified people within each club, you know, and within each county to just reach out and get that kind of support, even if it's not on the pitch all the time, that support could just be one session every few weeks, and just mimic that. Just mimic those for 15 minutes after a session or before a session. Just mimic, you know, this session for us.
Yeah, that's been excellent, Philip. And you want to wrap up with their current research coming up in Carlow or anything like that?
Sure, look, yeah, like I mentioned, look, the whole coaching space is fascinating, and we all kind of have our different approaches. So there is no one size fits all. I think the purpose of what I'm trying to maybe get across is that can we use games and maybe just shift away from the traditional approach a little bit more when it allows. But from a research perspective, look, I'm currently on that project that Andrew Lane is looking after regarding plyometric training within female Gaelic athletes. So where that goes over the next 3 years will be interesting. Dr. Paul Byrne and Dr. Richard Bulger from SCTU are also on the project. So it's definitely an exciting kind of one. It piggybacks nicely off some of the research I've done there as well. So yeah, no, that's kind of where the research journey is at the minute.
Excellent. That's brilliant. Thanks so much for your time, Philip, and we'll hopefully have you back on again in the future.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, John.